The rain came down like nails against the windows of the Ashford pack house, and Elena pressed her hand against her swollen belly as she stood frozen in the hallway. Through the half-open door of the study, she saw her husband, Alpha Cain Ashford, standing far too close to her own sister, Mira. Their voices were low, but the words cut through the storm outside louder than any thunder. Elena had known something was wrong for weeks. Cain had grown distant since she told him she was carrying his child. He no longer looked at her the way he once did, back when he had promised her forever under the old oak tree at the edge of the territory. Now his eyes only softened when Mira walked into a room. She should have turned around. She should have walked away and pretended she saw nothing, but her feet would not move, and her heart pounded so hard she feared they would hear it over the rain. "She is going to find out eventually," Mira said, her voice trembling, but not with guilt. "You cannot keep pretending forever, Cain." "I know," Cain answered, and there was no warmth in his voice, no hesitation, nothing that sounded like the man Elena had married 3 years ago. The baby was never supposed to happen. It was a mistake from the start. The words struck Elena harder than any physical blow could have. She placed both hands over her belly, as if she could shield the small life inside her from the cruelty of his voice. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Not yet, not while she could still hear more. "What will you do?" Mira asked. "I will end it," Cain said simply. "Tonight, before this goes any further." Elena stepped back from the door, her breath catching in her throat. She did not wait to hear what he meant by those words. She turned and hurried down the hallway, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor, her mind racing faster than the storm outside. She reached their bedroom and grabbed a cloak, wrapping it around her shoulders with shaking hands. She did not know where she would go. She only knew she could not stay in that house another moment, not after hearing her husband speak of her child as a mistake to be erased. The door to the study opened behind her before she could escape down the back stairs. Cain's voice called her name, sharp and commanding, the voice of an alpha who was used to being obeyed without question. "Elena." She turned slowly, her back straight despite the fear rushing through her veins. Cain stood in the hallway with Mira just behind him, and for a moment, none of them spoke. The rain hammered against the roof, filling the silence with its steady roar. "How long were you standing there?" Cain asked, his tone flat, giving nothing away. "Long enough," Elena said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Long enough to hear you call our child a mistake." Cain's jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. Instead, he stepped closer, and Elena forced herself not to retreat, even though every instinct told her to run. "You were never supposed to get pregnant," Cain said. "The alliance with the Voss remnants depends on me marrying within the council bloodlines. A child with you complicates everything I have worked for." Elena felt something inside her break, quiet and final, like a thread snapping under too much weight. She had given this man everything. She had left her own birth pack to stand beside him, had supported him through every difficult decision, had believed in every promise he whispered to her in the dark. "So that is what I am to you," she said. "A complication." "Elena, please," Mira started, but Cain raised a hand, silencing her immediately. "You will leave tonight," Cain said, and the command in his voice left no room for argument. "I will not have you spreading lies about me to the pack. Take what you need and go. By morning, I want no trace of you left in this territory." Thunder cracked outside, so loud the windows rattled in their frames. Elena stared at the man she had loved, searching his face for any sign of the person she once knew, any flicker of regret or hesitation. She found nothing. His eyes were as cold and distant as the storm clouds gathering over the mountains. "You would send your pregnant wife into a storm," Elena said quietly, "rather than face the shame of ending things properly. I am giving you a chance to leave with dignity," Cain said. "Do not test me further." Elena looked past him, to where Mira stood, unable to meet her sister's eyes, wrapped in guilt she clearly had not expected to feel. There would be no help from that direction, no last-minute change of heart. Elena was truly alone. She turned without another word and walked down the back stairs, out through the kitchen door, into the storm that raged across the Ashford territory. The rain soaked through her cloak within seconds, cold water running down her back and legs, but she did not stop walking. She could not stay in that house one more second, not with the weight of Kane's rejection pressing down on her chest. Behind her, she heard the front door of the pack house close, and the sound of the lock turning felt like the final period at the end of a sentence that had taken years to write. Kane was not coming after her. He was not going to change his mind. He had made his choice, and he had chosen his ambition over his family. Elena walked through the dark forest paths she had once walked freely as the Alpha's wife, paths now leading her away from everything she had known. Lightning split the sky above the trees, illuminating the narrow trail for brief flashes, before plunging her back into darkness. Her feet ached against the rough ground, and her belly tightened with the first uncomfortable pull of tension, though she told herself it was only the stress of the night, not anything more serious. She had nowhere to go. Her birth pack was 3 territories away, too far to reach on foot in this weather, especially in her condition. She had no allies within the Ashford lands, no friends who would risk Kane's anger by taking her in. She had built her entire world around a man who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience to be removed. The wind picked up, tearing at her cloak, and Elena stumbled over an exposed root, catching herself against a tree trunk before she fell. Her hands scraped against the bark, and she gasped at the sudden shock of pain, but she forced herself to keep moving. Stopping meant thinking about how frightened she truly was, and she could not afford fear right now. She needed to find shelter before the storm grew any worse. She thought of the border, the line that separated Ashford territory from the lands beyond, lands that belonged to no pack council recognized, lands ruled over by a man the entire region spoke of, only in hushed and fearful tones. Draven Voss, the exiled war king. A man stripped of his title years ago, banished, for reasons that changed depending on who told the story. Elena had never met him. She had only heard the rumors, the warnings passed between pack members who spoke of him as a monster, a dangerous outcast who ruled his exiled lands through fear and force. The idea of walking toward his territory should have terrified her more than staying in Ashford lands, but something about it felt different tonight. Kane, the man she trusted completely, had shown her exactly what cruelty looked like when it wore a familiar, loving face. She did not know if she was walking toward the border on purpose, or if her feet simply carried her there without conscious thought. Either way, the forest grew thicker and wilder the further she went, the trees older and taller, the underbrush tangled and difficult to move through. She was exhausted, cold, and increasingly aware of a dull ache spreading through her lower back that worried her more with each passing minute. A branch cracked somewhere to her left, and Elena froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She scanned the darkness, straining to see through the rain and shadows, but she could make out nothing beyond the shapes of trees swaying in the wind. She told herself it was only an animal, perhaps a deer startled by the storm, and forced herself to keep walking. The ground began to slope downward, leading her toward a ravine she vaguely remembered hearing about, a natural boundary between territories that few dared to cross without permission. Her foot slipped on the wet leaves covering the slope, and this time she could not catch herself in time. She fell hard, her hip striking the ground, pain flaring through her side as she rolled several feet before coming to a stop against a fallen log. For a moment, she simply lay there, rain pouring down on her face, too exhausted and too much in pain to move. She pressed a hand against her belly, relieved to feel the baby shift inside her, a small reassurance that they were both still safe despite everything. "Please," she whispered into the storm, not entirely sure who or what she was asking. "Please let us be all right." She did not know how long she lay there before she heard the sound of something large moving through the brush nearby, footsteps too heavy and too deliberate to belong to any small forest creature. Fear spiked through her, sharp and immediate, and she tried to push herself upright, but her body refused to cooperate, too weak and too shaken from the fall. A shape emerged from the tree line, massive and dark against the storm, and Elena's breath caught in her throat. It was a wolf, but unlike any wolf she had ever seen, far larger than even the biggest shifters she knew, with fur so dark it seemed to absorb the little light the storm allowed through the clouds. Its eyes glowed faintly, an unnatural shade that made her think, absurdly, of old stories her grandmother used to tell about spirit wolves that walked between worlds. Elena's instincts screamed at her to run, but her body simply could not obey. She lay in the mud, rain soaking through every layer of her clothing, and stared up at the creature as it approached slowly, its massive paws silent despite its size. The wolf stopped a few feet away and lowered its head, studying her with an intensity that felt almost human. Elena held perfectly still, too frightened to move, too exhausted to do anything but wait and see what would happen next. She braced herself for the worst, closing her eyes as the wolf came closer. But instead of an attack, she felt something warm and gentle press against her shoulder. She opened her eyes to find the wolf nudging her with its massive head, a motion so careful and deliberate that it could not have been anything other than intentional. It nudged her again, more insistently this time, clearly trying to encourage her to move. "You want me to get up," Elena said quietly, disbelief coloring her voice as much as the pain still radiating through her body. "I do not think I can." The wolf made a low sound, something between a whine and a growl, and circled around her, positioning itself so its body pressed against her back, offering warmth against the biting cold of the storm. Elena felt tears mixing with the rain on her face, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness from a creature that had every reason, by nature, to see her as nothing more than easy prey. She did not know how long they stayed like that, the wolf shielding her from the worst of the wind, while she gathered enough strength to move again. Eventually, with the wolf's steady presence beside her, she managed to push herself upright, leaning heavily against its powerful frame for support. "Where do you want to take me?" she asked, knowing the creature could not answer, but needing to say something into the silence of the storm. The wolf turned its head toward the ravine, toward the boundary line that marked the edge of forbidden territory, and began to walk, glancing back to make sure she followed. Elena hesitated only a moment before she stumbled after it, one hand pressed against her aching belly, the other trailing along the wolf's thick fur for balance. She had no idea what waited for her on the other side of that border. She only knew that for the first time all night, she did not feel entirely alone in the storm. The ravine stretched wide and dark beneath them, its steep walls slick with rain and moss, and Elena hesitated at the edge, uncertain how she would ever manage the climb down in her condition. The wolf seemed to sense her fear, moving ahead to find a gentler path along the slope, one that curved more gradually toward the bottom, and waited for her to catch up before continuing. Every step felt like a battle. Her muscles trembled with exhaustion, and the ache in her lower back had settled into something sharper, something that made her breath catch every few minutes. She tried not to think about what it might mean, focusing instead on placing one foot in front of the other, on keeping pace with the massive creature guiding her through the darkness. "How much further?" she murmured, more to herself than to the wolf, though it turned its head briefly at the sound of her voice, as if checking on her. They reached the bottom of the ravine, where a shallow stream cut through the rocks, swollen and fast from the storm above. The wolf paused at the water's edge, studying the current before choosing a crossing point where the rocks sat close enough together for Elena to step across without wading through the freezing water directly. Even so, her foot slipped on the last stone, and she went down hard onto her knees in the shallows. The cold shocked through her entire body, and for a moment she could not find the strength to rise. The wolf was beside her instantly, nudging beneath her arm, offering its shoulder as leverage. Elena gripped its fur and pulled herself upright, grateful beyond words for the steady support. "Thank you," she whispered, her teeth chattering from the cold. "I do not know what I would do without you right now." They climbed the far side of the ravine together, the ground growing rockier and steeper as they went, until they reached a narrow trail that wound between ancient trees Elena did not recognize. The forest here felt different somehow, older and wilder, as though few travelers dared to walk these paths. She understood, distantly, that they had crossed into the territory everyone in Ashford Lands spoke of with fear. The rain began to ease as they walked deeper into the unfamiliar woods, though the wind still howled through the treetops, sending down showers of loose leaves and broken branches. Elena kept close to the wolf, drawing what comfort she could from its solid presence beside her, though her mind kept circling back to the same worried thoughts. What if this territory was as dangerous as everyone claimed? What if she was walking straight into a different kind of danger, one that would not show her the same unexpected mercy the wolf had? She had little choice but to keep moving forward. Behind her lay only Cain's rejection, and a storm that threatened to overwhelm her strength entirely. Ahead lay uncertainty, but at least it came with the possibility of shelter, of warmth, of a chance to protect the child growing inside her. A distant howl rose above the wind, long and mournful, followed quickly by an answering call from somewhere closer. Elena's pulse quickened, and she reached instinctively for the wolf's fur, though it showed no sign of alarm at the sounds. If anything, it seemed to walk with more purpose now, as though the howls confirmed they were heading in the right direction. "Are those your pack?" Elena asked quietly, though she doubted the wolf could truly understand her words, comforted only by the act of speaking aloud in the darkness. They emerged from the dense trees onto a wider path, worn smooth by frequent use, leading toward a cluster of firelight, visible through the remaining branches ahead. Elena's breath caught at the sight, relief and fresh fear warring inside her chest. Whatever waited at the end of this path, it was clearly inhabited, clearly protected, clearly the heart of the territory she had heard so many warnings about. The wolf slowed its pace as they approached, positioning itself slightly ahead of her, almost protectively, and Elena understood without needing words that it wanted her to stay close. She gripped a handful of its fur again, drawing courage from the contact, and continued walking toward the firelight. Shapes began to emerge from the shadows around the camp, figures moving with the quiet efficiency of trained fighters, some human in appearance, others clearly shifted into wolf form despite the late hour. Elena felt dozens of eyes turn toward her as she stepped into the clearing, and she forced herself to stand as straight as her exhausted body would allow, refusing to appear weaker than she already felt. A tall man stepped forward from the group near the largest fire, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He wore simple, practical clothing, nothing like the fine garments Cain favored, but there was an unmistakable authority in the way he carried himself, in the way the others around him instinctively made space for his approach. "Who are you?" the man asked, his voice low and controlled, carrying easily over the sound of the dying storm. "And why has Ashen brought you into our lands?" Elena assumed Ashen must be the name of the wolf beside her, though she had no time to consider the implications of that before the man's dark eyes settled fully on her, taking in her soaked clothing, her visibly pregnant belly, the exhaustion clearly written across her face. "My name is Elena," she said, her voice shaking, despite her effort to sound steady. "I did not choose to come here on purpose. I was lost in the storm, and this wolf found me, and led me to your camp." Murmurs rippled through the gathered fighters, and Elena caught fragments of conversation she could not fully understand. Words about the border, about Ashen's unusual behavior, about what her presence might mean. The tall man raised a hand, and the murmuring immediately quieted, every person in the clearing deferring instantly to his silent command. "You are far from Ashford territory," the man observed, and Elena's stomach tightened at the mention of her former pack, wondering how much this stranger already knew about her situation. "That is quite a distance to walk in a storm, especially in your condition." "I did not have much choice," Elena said, unwilling to explain the full truth of her situation to a stranger, surrounded by armed fighters in the middle of the night. "I needed somewhere to go." The man studied her for a long moment, his expression giving nothing away, and Elena found herself holding her breath under the weight of his scrutiny. Finally, he glanced down at the wolf still standing protectively beside her, and something shifted in his features, a flicker of surprise quickly masked behind careful control. "Ashen has not approached a stranger like this in years," the man said, more to himself than to Elena, though she caught the words clearly enough. "Not since my mother passed." He looked back to Elena, and this time there was something less guarded in his eyes, a curiosity that had not been there before. "I am Draven Voss," he said, and Elena's breath caught at the confirmation of who exactly she now stood before. "Whatever brought you to my territory, you will not find shelter standing out here in the rain. Come inside, before the storm returns in full force." Elena hesitated, torn between relief at the offer of shelter and lingering fear of everything she had heard about this man and his exiled territory. But the ache in her back had grown sharper, and exhaustion pressed heavily against every part of her body, leaving her with little energy to consider alternatives. "Thank you," she said quietly, and allowed herself to be led toward the largest structure in the camp, a solid wooden building that looked far sturdier than she had expected from an exiled territory supposedly built on chaos and violence. Draven walked beside her, matching his pace to her slower steps, while Ashen followed closely behind, never straying far from her side. The fighters around the fire watched their approach with expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion, and Elena felt the weight of their attention, like a physical thing pressing against her back. Inside, the building was warmer than she expected, a fire already burning in a stone hearth at the far end of the main room. Draven gestured toward a chair near the fire, and Elena sank into it gratefully, her legs finally giving out beneath the accumulated strain of the night's journey. "You are further along than I initially realized," Draven said, his eyes flickering briefly to her belly before returning to her face, his expression carefully neutral. "When is the child expected?" "Soon," Elena admitted, wrapping her arms around herself as the warmth of the fire began to ease some of the chill from her bones. "Though tonight has made me worry it might be sooner than planned." Something in her tone must have caught his attention, because Draven's expression shifted, concern replacing the careful neutrality from before. "Are you in pain?" he asked directly, no hesitation in the question, despite how little he knew her. "A little," Elena admitted, not wanting to worry him unnecessarily, though the tightening sensation in her lower back had not fully faded since her fall in the ravine. "I think I am simply exhausted from the walk." Draven called out a name, and moments later, an older woman entered the room, her expression sharpening with immediate purpose when she took in the scene before her. Draven spoke quietly to her, and the woman nodded, moving to Elena's side with practiced efficiency, checking her pulse, asking careful questions about how far along she was, and what symptoms she had experienced. Elena answered as best she could, grateful for the woman's calm presence, though anxiety still coiled tightly in her chest. She had not expected to find this kind of care in a territory known throughout the region for violence and exile, had not expected the man everyone called dangerous to show such immediate concern for a stranger who had wandered uninvited into his lands. "She needs rest and warmth," the woman finally announced, straightening from her examination. "The baby's heartbeat is strong, but she has pushed her body too hard tonight. She should not travel further until she has recovered properly." Draven nodded, something unreadable passing across his features as he looked toward Elena again. "You will stay here," he said, and though the words could have sounded like a command, there was something almost gentle in how he spoke them. "At least until you and the child are strong enough to decide what comes next." Elena wanted to protest, wanted to insist she could not impose on the hospitality of a man his own council once called dangerous enough to exile, but exhaustion overwhelmed whatever pride remained after the night's events. She simply nodded, grateful beyond words for the unexpected kindness she had found at the end of the worst night of her life. Outside, the storm continued to rage against the walls of the camp, but inside, beside the warmth of the fire, Elena finally allowed herself to close her eyes and rest. Morning light filtered weakly through the shuttered windows when Elena finally woke, her body sore in ways she had never experienced before. For a moment, disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings, she forgot where she was, forgot the events of the previous night entirely. Then memory returned in a rush: the storm, Kane's cruel words, the long walk through the forest, the massive wolf that had led her to safety. She sat up slowly, taking in the small room she had been given, simple but clean, with a narrow bed and a single wooden chair positioned near a modest fireplace that had burned down to glowing embers overnight. Someone had left dry clothing folded neatly on the chair, along with a pitcher of water and a small basin. Elena changed out of her still damp clothes from the night before, grateful for the dry fabric against her skin, though the garments were clearly meant for someone taller and broader than herself. She smoothed the fabric as best she could and made her way toward the door, uncertain what awaited her beyond the small room that had offered her shelter through the worst of the storm. The main room of the building stood empty when she stepped out, the fire from the previous night reduced to gentle coals in the hearth. Sunlight streamed through the windows now, illuminating a space that seemed less foreboding in daylight than it had during the storm. Elena moved closer to the window and looked out at the camp beyond, taking in details she had missed the night before in her exhaustion. The camp was larger than she had expected, a collection of sturdy wooden buildings arranged around a central clearing, with smoke rising from several chimneys despite the early hour. Fighters moved between the structures, some in human form, others clearly shifted, all appearing to have purpose and direction rather than the chaos she had been led to believe defined this territory. The door opened behind her, and Elena turned to find Draven entering the room, his expression composed, but watchful, as his eyes settled on her. He looked different in daylight than he had appeared during the storm, less like the shadowy figure of rumor, and more like an ordinary man, though there remained something undeniably commanding in his bearing. "You are looking stronger this morning," he observed, moving toward the fireplace to add fresh wood to the coals. Grace tells me the child's heartbeat remains steady. Grace is the woman who examined me last night, Elena said, remembering the older woman's calm efficiency and gentle hands. She has served this territory as a healer for many years, Draven confirmed. Longer than I have led it, in fact. If she says the child is well, then you can trust her judgment. Elena settled carefully into one of the chairs near the fire, watching as Draven finished tending the flames, before taking the seat across from her. There was a careful distance in how he positioned himself, close enough to speak comfortably, but far enough to give her space, and Elena found herself grateful for the consideration. I owe you my thanks, she said, breaking the silence that had settled between them, for taking me in last night, and for allowing me to stay. I know this territory does not typically welcome outsiders. Draven's expression shifted slightly, something guarded entering his eyes. You have heard the stories about this place then. I have heard many things, Elena admitted honestly, unwilling to pretend otherwise. Though I suppose I should not put too much trust in stories, given how the past day has gone for me. Something almost like amusement flickered across Draven's face, quickly smoothed away, though Elena caught the brief change before it disappeared. A wise conclusion, he said. Stories rarely capture the full truth of anything. Elena studied him for a moment, curiosity overcoming some of her lingering caution. Why did you take me in? You did not know me. For all you knew, I could have been sent by an enemy pack to spy on your territory. Ashen would not have let an enemy to my door, Draven said, his tone matter of fact, though Elena sensed there was more depth to his answer than the simple statement suggested. That wolf has not shown interest in a stranger in many years. Whatever brought you across that ravine last night, it was not something I was willing to ignore. Is Ashen your wolf? Elena asked, remembering the connection the fighters had mentioned the night before, something about bloodlines and spirits. Draven was quiet for a long moment before answering, his gaze drifting toward the window as though looking at something far beyond the walls of the room. Ashen belonged to my mother, he finally said, a spirit wolf, bonded to our bloodline generations ago, passed down through choice rather than blood alone. When my mother died, Ashen withdrew from the pack entirely, wandering the territory alone, answering to no one, not even me. Until last night, Elena said quietly, beginning to understand the significance of what had happened in the storm. Until last night, Draven confirmed, his eyes returning to hers with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. Ashen has not approached anyone with that kind of purpose since my mother's passing. I do not know what that means for you, but I know it is not something I can dismiss as simple chance. Elena did not know how to respond to that, uncertain what significance she could possibly hold for a spirit wolf, bonded to a bloodline she knew nothing about. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and Draven seemed to notice, his expression softening slightly. You do not need to have answers right now, he said. You survived a difficult night, and you carry a child who needs you to rest and recover. Whatever meaning lies behind Ashen's actions, it can wait until you are stronger. The kindness in his words caught Elena off guard, so different from the cold calculation she had witnessed in Cain the previous night. She found herself studying Draven more carefully, searching for the monster the stories described, but finding instead a man who seemed genuinely concerned for her well-being, despite having no obligation to be. May I ask you something? Elena said, curiosity pushing past her usual caution. The stories say you were exiled for terrible crimes, that you led violence against your own pack council, but nothing about how you have treated me matches those stories. Draven's expression hardened slightly, old pain flickering behind his eyes, before he masked it with practiced control. The council tells the story that benefits them, he said, his voice carefully measured despite the tension Elena could sense building beneath his calm exterior. I will not burden you with the details of old grievances on your first morning here. It is enough to say that not everything you have heard about my exile reflects the truth. Elena nodded, sensing the topic was one he was not ready to discuss further, and respecting the boundary, even as her curiosity remained unsatisfied. She understood something about carrying pain that others refused to fully believe, having just experienced her own version of betrayal at the hands of someone she trusted completely. I understand, she said simply. Some stories are complicated to tell. Draven studied her for a long moment, something like gratitude passing briefly across his features before he stood, moving toward the door. You should rest further, he said. Grace will check on you again this afternoon, and I will have food brought to your room, if you prefer privacy. Or you are welcome to join the others for the midday meal, if you feel strong enough. I think I would like to see more of the territory, Elena said, surprising herself with the admission, though the words felt true as soon as she spoke them. Curiosity about this strange place and its complicated leader had begun to outweigh her exhaustion. Draven nodded, something like approval in his expression. Then I will show you what I can, once you have eaten something, and Grace has confirmed you are strong enough for walking. He left the room, and Elena remained by the fire, turning over everything she had learned that morning. The exiled war king everyone feared had shown her nothing but consideration and care, since the moment his wolf had led her into his territory. She did not yet understand why, but she found herself increasingly curious to learn the truth behind the stories, and increasingly grateful for the unexpected shelter she had found at the end of the worst night of her life. Outside her window, she could see Ashen resting near the edge of the clearing, the massive wolf's dark eyes watching the building where she stayed, as though standing guard over something precious that needed protecting. Elena watched the wolf for a long while, wondering what exactly had drawn the ancient creature to her in the middle of that storm, and what it might mean for the uncertain path that now lay ahead of her. Days passed slowly in the exiled territory, and Elena found herself settling into a rhythm she had not expected to find in a place so many people spoke of with fear. Grace visited each morning to check on the pregnancy, always finding the baby strong and healthy despite the ordeal of that first stormy night, and Elena began to feel her own strength returning as the days went by. The camp itself proved far more organized than any rumor had suggested. Fighters trained each morning in the clearing near the central fire, their movements disciplined and precise, nothing like the chaotic violence Elena had been led to expect from an exiled war criminal's followers. Children ran between the buildings during quieter hours, laughing and playing games that reminded Elena achingly of her own childhood, back before politics and pack alliances had complicated everything about her life. She spent much of her time near the healer's quarters, helping Grace prepare herbs and remedies when her energy allowed, grateful for something productive to occupy her hands and mind, while she waited for news of what might come next. She had sent no word to her birth pack about her situation, uncertain how they would react to learning she had taken shelter in Draven Voss's territory of all places. Draven himself remained a puzzle she could not quite solve. He was distant in some ways, careful to maintain proper boundaries, never overstepping what courtesy required of a host. But she noticed small kindnesses too, extra blankets left outside her door on colder nights, fresh fruit set aside specifically for her when supplies ran limited, quiet conversations he initiated when he noticed her sitting alone with troubled thoughts. "You seem tired today," Draven observed one afternoon, finding her seated near the edge of the clearing, watching the fighters practice their sparring drills. He settled onto the bench beside her, close enough for conversation, but still maintaining that careful distance he always kept. "The baby has been restless," Elena admitted, one hand resting against her belly where she could feel small movements beneath her palm. "Grace says it is normal this close to my time, but it makes sleeping difficult." "How much longer?" Draven asked, and Elena noted, not for the first time, how genuinely interested he seemed in details about her pregnancy, questions Cain had rarely bothered asking, even before their marriage had begun falling apart. "Grace believes only a few more weeks," Elena said. "Though after everything that happened during the storm, I am not entirely certain the timeline remains accurate." Draven's expression grew serious at the reminder of that first night, and Elena watched something protective settle across his features, an instinct she recognized from how carefully his fighters guarded the borders of the territory. "You are safe here," he said quietly. "Whatever happens with the child, you will have every resource this territory can offer." "Why?" Elena asked, the question she had been holding back for days finally slipping free. "You do not know me, Draven. I arrived here as a stranger in the middle of a storm, and you have shown me more kindness than most people show their own family. I do not understand why." Draven was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fighters training in the clearing, though Elena sensed his attention remained entirely on their conversation. "Perhaps because I understand what it feels like to be abandoned by those who should have protected you," he finally said, his voice carrying a weight of old pain carefully controlled. "Will you tell me what happened?" Elena asked gently. "How you came to be exiled?" You said before that the stories do not reflect the full truth. Draven's jaw tightened, and for a moment Elena feared she had pushed too far, that he would retreat behind the careful walls he maintained around his past. But then he began speaking, his voice low and measured, as though he had rehearsed this explanation many times, without ever finding the right person to share it with. I was young when I became alpha of my birth pack, he said. Younger than most, thrust into leadership after my father's sudden death. The pack council saw an opportunity in my inexperience, believed they could control my decisions, and steer the pack toward alliances that benefited their own interests, rather than the well-being of our territory. Elena listened carefully, giving him the space to continue at his own pace, recognizing the difficulty in sharing painful history with someone still relatively new to his trust. I refused their demands, Draven continued, refused to marry into an alliance that would have stripped our territory of its resources for the benefit of neighboring packs. The council did not appreciate my resistance. They fabricated evidence, claimed I had committed violence against pack members who opposed me, painted me as unstable and dangerous, to justify stripping me of my title. And no one believed you, Elena said softly, understanding dawning as she pieced together the shape of what had happened to him. Some did, Draven said. Enough followed me into exile that we were able to build something here, a territory the council believes is chaotic and lawless, when in truth, it operates with more fairness than the corrupt system that cast us out ever offered. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a growing understanding of the man beside her that went far beyond the frightening rumors she had heard before arriving in his territory. Kane's father sat on that council, did he not? She asked, remembering fragments of conversation she had overheard during her marriage. Draven's eyes sharpened with surprise at the connection she had drawn. He did, he confirmed, one of the primary voices pushing for my exile, in fact. It seems our paths were connected long before Ashen led you across that ravine. I am sorry, Elena said quietly, for what happened to you. It sounds remarkably similar to how quickly Kane discarded me once I became inconvenient to his ambitions. Draven's expression softened with genuine sympathy, and for the first time since her arrival, Elena saw something raw and unguarded in his eyes, a shared understanding of betrayal that connected them despite the very different circumstances that had brought them to this moment. The people who are supposed to protect us sometimes cause the deepest wounds, he said. I am sorry you experienced that as well. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fighters train, each lost in their own thoughts about the paths that had led them to this shared moment in the exiled territory. Elena found herself grateful for the honesty Draven had offered, for the trust he had extended in sharing his difficult history with her. Thank you for telling me, she finally said. I know that could not have been easy to share. You needed to understand why I chose to help you, Draven said. It was not simple charity. When I saw you that night, soaked through and abandoned in the storm, I recognized something of my own experience in your situation. I could not turn you away, regardless of what old rumors say about who I am supposed to be. The conversation shifted after that, moving toward lighter topics as the afternoon wore on, Draven asking about her own childhood, about the pack she had grown up in before her marriage to Kane had taken her away from everything familiar. Elena found herself talking more freely than she had in years, comforted by his genuine interest and the absence of judgment in how he listened. As the sun began setting over the training clearing, casting long shadows across the camp, Elena realized she had spent hours in easy conversation with a man she had feared meeting only days before. Something had shifted between them during their exchange, a fragile trust building despite the short time they had known each other, born from shared pain and unexpected kindness in equal measure. That night, as she settled into her bed and felt the baby shift restlessly beneath her hands, Elena found herself thinking not of Kane's cruel rejection, but of Draven's quiet honesty beside the training clearing, of the way his eyes had softened when he spoke of understanding her pain. For the first time since fleeing into that terrible storm, she felt something close to hope beginning to take root in her chest, fragile but undeniably present. 2 weeks passed, and Elena found herself more integrated into the daily rhythms of the exiled territory than she had ever anticipated. She had learned the names of many of the fighters who trained each morning in the clearing, had shared meals with families she once would have crossed streets to avoid, based on frightening rumors alone. The territory that outsiders called dangerous had become, unexpectedly, the closest thing to a true home she had known since leaving her birth pack years earlier. Her friendship with Draven had deepened steadily during those weeks, evolving from cautious conversations into something that felt increasingly natural and easy. He sought her out most afternoons, sometimes to discuss matters of the territory, sometimes simply to sit together in comfortable silence while she rested near the fire, or walked slowly through the camp, for exercise Grace insisted was good for both her and the baby. "You have not mentioned your family since arriving," Draven observed one evening, finding her seated outside watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. "Your birth pack, I mean. Have you sent word to them about your situation?" Elena hesitated, uncertain how to explain the complicated feelings surrounding that question. "I have not," she finally admitted. "My relationship with my parents has been strained since I chose to marry Cain against their wishes. They warned me about his ambition, about how easily he might discard those who no longer served his purposes. I did not want to hear it at the time." "And your sister?" Draven asked carefully, having learned enough of Elena's history to understand the painful role Mira had played in the events leading to her exile from Ashford lands. "Mira and I were close once," Elena said, sadness coloring her voice. "Before Cain. I do not know what happened between them, how long their involvement lasted before that night in the storm. I have tried not to dwell on it too much, though it is difficult not to feel betrayed by both of them." Draven reached over, his hand briefly covering hers where it rested on the bench between them, a small gesture of comfort that had become increasingly common between them over the past weeks. "You do not owe them your forgiveness," he said quietly. "Not until you are ready, if ever." Elena appreciated his understanding, more than she could easily express, grateful for a companion who did not pressure her toward reconciliation or judgment, simply allowing her the space to process her complicated emotions at her own pace. "What about you?" she asked, turning the conversation toward him. "Do you have family beyond this territory? Anyone from before the exile who still speaks with you?" Draven's expression grew distant, old grief flickering behind his careful control. "My mother passed before the exile," he said. "My father, years before that. I have no siblings, no extended family who chose to follow me when the council turned against me. The people here, the fighters and families who built this territory alongside me, they have become the only family I have left." "That must be lonely," Elena said softly, understanding the particular ache of losing the family you were born into, and having to build something new from unexpected circumstances. "It was," Draven admitted. "For a long time, honestly. Leadership can be isolating, especially when you carry the weight of decisions that affect everyone who chose to trust you with their safety. I did not realize how much I had grown accustomed to that isolation until recently." Something in his tone made Elena's heart quicken slightly, and she glanced over to find him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch, warm and open in a way she had not seen from him before. "Until recently," she repeated softly, unable to keep the question from her voice. Draven's hand tightened slightly around hers, still resting where he had placed it moments before. "Since Ashen led you into this territory," he said, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable than she had heard him sound before. "I have found myself looking forward to our conversations, more than I expected, finding reasons to seek you out, to make certain you are comfortable and cared for, beyond what simple hospitality requires." Elena's pulse raced at his admission, complicated feelings swirling through her chest. Part of her recognized the danger in allowing herself to feel anything beyond gratitude toward this man, given everything she had just survived with Cain, given the vulnerability of her current situation, as an heavily pregnant woman relying on his protection. But another part of her, the part that had felt so thoroughly discarded and unworthy after Cain's rejection, could not deny how genuinely cared for she felt in Draven's presence. "I have felt something similar," she admitted quietly, the words feeling both terrifying and honest as she spoke them aloud for the first time. "Though I worry, it is too soon, given everything that happened before I arrived here. I do not want to confuse gratitude for something deeper, not when my emotions are still so raw from Cain's betrayal." Draven nodded, understanding rather than disappointment in his expression. "That is wise caution," he said. "I do not expect anything from you, Elena. You have survived something painful, and you carry a child who deserves your full attention right now, not complicated romantic entanglements you are not ready for." But you do not deny that something exists between us, Elena said, needing to acknowledge the truth even as she maintained her caution about pursuing it further. I would not deny it if you asked me directly, Draven said honestly. But I am content to let whatever this is grow slowly, at whatever pace feels right to you. You owe me nothing beyond your honesty, and I intend to earn whatever trust you eventually feel comfortable extending toward me. His words settled something anxious in Elena's chest, grateful for his patience and understanding in a situation that could have easily become complicated or uncomfortable given the vulnerability of her circumstances. She squeezed his hand gently before releasing it, the moment feeling significant despite its simplicity. Thank you, she said, for understanding, and for everything you have done since that first night. I do not think I have properly expressed how grateful I am for the safety I have found here. You do not need to thank me further, Draven said, though warmth colored his expression at her words. Seeing you and the child healthy and safe is more than enough reward for whatever help I have offered. They sat together as the sun finished setting, comfortable silence settling between them once more, though something had shifted in the quality of that silence, an unspoken understanding growing between them that neither felt the need to rush or force into definition before they were both ready. Later that evening, as Elena prepared for sleep, she found herself thinking not of the uncertain future ahead, but of the warmth in Draven's eyes when he had admitted his growing feelings, of the patience and understanding he had shown, despite everything she still needed to process. For the first time since fleeing Kane's cruelty into that terrible storm, Elena allowed herself to imagine a future that might hold something beyond mere survival, something that might actually resemble happiness once again. But even as hope grew tentatively in her chest, a small worry persisted at the edges of her thoughts. Kane would not remain ignorant of her survival forever, and when word eventually reached him that she had found shelter in his sworn enemy's territory, she doubted his response would be simple or peaceful. Whatever fragile happiness she had begun building in this unexpected home, she suspected it would soon be tested in ways she was not yet prepared to face. The peaceful weeks Elena had grown accustomed to came to an abrupt end on a quiet morning, when one of Draven's scouts returned to camp at a full run, his expression grim as he sought out his leader immediately. Elena watched from where she sat near the healer's quarters as the scout spoke quickly and quietly to Draven, watching his composed expression shift into something harder and more guarded with each word. She rose carefully, curiosity and worry pulling her toward the conversation, despite the distance she usually maintained from matters of territory business. By the time she reached them, the scout had finished his report, and Draven's jaw was set in a tight line that told her something significant had happened. "What is it?" she asked, unable to keep the concern from her voice, as she looked between Draven and the visibly exhausted scout. Draven hesitated for a moment before answering, and Elena recognized the careful consideration in his expression, the weighing of how much to share with her about whatever news had just arrived. Finally, he seemed to decide honesty served her better than protective silence. "Word has reached Kane about your survival," Draven said. "And about your location. One of our scouts overheard conversations at the border markets, suggesting Ashford territory has learned you are sheltering here." Elena's stomach dropped, fear immediately overtaking the sense of security she had built over the past weeks in this unexpected home. "How?" she asked, though she suspected the answer mattered less than the reality of the situation now facing them. "Word travels between territories regardless of borders," Draven said grimly. "Traders, travelers, even pack members who cross boundaries for various reasons. It was perhaps inevitable that news of your presence here would eventually reach Kane, especially given how visibly your pregnancy has progressed during your time in this territory." "What will he do?" Elena asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer, remembering the cold calculation she had witnessed in Kane's eyes the night he ordered her out into the storm. Draven's expression grew even more serious, and he glanced toward the scout for confirmation before answering. "According to what we have heard, Kane is gathering forces. The scout believes he intends to march on this territory, to reclaim you and the child by whatever means necessary." Fear coiled tightly through Elena's chest, memories of Kane's cold rejection mixing uncomfortably with the growing terror of what his return might mean, not just for herself, but for the entire territory that had shown her nothing but kindness during her time of greatest need. "Why would he want me back?" she asked, confused by the apparent contradiction between his earlier rejection and this sudden aggressive interest in reclaiming her. He called our child a mistake. He ordered me out of his territory himself. Ancient pack law, Draven said quietly, understanding dawning in his expression, as he pieced together the political implications. A child born under the protection of an exiled bloodline carries certain rights that Cain cannot afford to ignore, especially given the ongoing tension between his council and mine. If word spreads that his abandoned wife found protection here, that his own child might grow up under my territory's protection rather than his, it undermines his authority significantly among the pack council he answers to. Elena felt sick at the realization that Cain's sudden interest in her had nothing to do with genuine regret or changed feelings, but rather political calculation about how her presence in Draven's territory might damage his reputation and standing among his allies. It was, in its own way, a betrayal even more painful than his original rejection, confirming that she had only ever mattered to him as far as she served his ambitions. "I will not go back to him," Elena said firmly, fear giving way to determination, as she considered what returning to Cain's control might mean for both herself and her child. "Whatever happens, I refuse to let him claim either of us again." Draven's expression softened slightly despite the tension of the situation, something protective and fierce entering his eyes. "You will not be forced to go anywhere," he said firmly. "This territory will defend you and your child, regardless of what forces Cain brings against our borders." "But that means fighting," Elena said, worry immediately overtaking her relief at his protective declaration. "I do not want to be the reason your people face danger, Draven. You have already given me so much. I cannot ask you to risk everything for my sake." "You are not asking," Draven said gently, taking her hands in his own with careful reassurance. "I am choosing this, Elena. You and your child deserve protection, and I refuse to let Cain's cruelty and political calculation determine your future when you have found safety here." The scout, who had remained respectfully quiet during this exchange, cleared his throat carefully to draw their attention. "There is more," he said hesitantly. "The forces gathering under Cain's command are significant. He has called upon allies from neighboring territories, using claims about ancient pack law violations to justify military action against our borders. This will not be a small skirmish, if he follows through on his stated intentions." Draven's expression grew grimmer at this additional information, and Elena watched him process the strategic implications of what they now faced. "How much time do we have?" he asked the scout directly. "Perhaps 2 weeks, based on the pace of their preparations," the scout answered. "Possibly less, if Cain decides to accelerate his timeline." Draven nodded, already beginning to think through the logistics of preparing his territory for potential conflict. "Gather the senior fighters," he instructed the scout. "We need to begin strengthening our defenses immediately, and I want updated reports on our current strength, compared to what intelligence suggests Cain has assembled." The scout departed quickly to carry out these instructions, leaving Elena and Draven alone once more, in the growing tension of their new reality. Elena felt overwhelmed by the sudden shift from the peaceful weeks she had grown accustomed to, fear for her unborn child mixing with guilt over bringing this danger to a territory that had shown her nothing but kindness. "This is my fault," she said quietly, unable to fully suppress the guilt weighing on her chest. "If I had never come here, your people would not be facing this threat." "Do not think that way," Draven said firmly, his hand still holding hers with gentle but insistent pressure. "Cain's cruelty is not your fault, Elena. His decision to abandon you in a storm, his cold calculation about political advantage, his willingness to threaten violence to reclaim what he sees as rightfully his, none of that reflects poorly on you. It reflects only on the kind of man he has always been." Elena wanted to believe him, wanted to release the guilt pressing so heavily against her chest, but the fear of what might come remained difficult to fully set aside. "What if we cannot defend against his forces?" she asked quietly, voicing the worry she had been trying to suppress since hearing the scout's report. "What if this territory suffers because of decisions Cain made, because of choices that were never truly mine to control?" "We will defend this territory," Draven said, conviction filling his voice despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead. "My fighters are skilled and loyal, and we have prepared for conflict before, even if this particular threat carries higher stakes than most. I will not allow Cain to simply walk into this territory and take what he believes belongs to him. not when what he actually seeks to reclaim are people who deserve far better than his cold ambition. Elena studied his determined expression, drawing strength from his conviction, even as fear continued to churn through her chest. She thought of the child growing inside her, so close now to being born into a world suddenly complicated by political calculation and threatened violence, and she felt a fierce protectiveness rise within her that helped steady her nerves. "Then let us prepare," she said, straightening her shoulders despite the exhaustion that had settled over her since hearing the scouts' news. "Whatever comes, I refuse to face it as helplessly as I faced that storm the night I fled Ashford territory. I want to help however I can." Draven nodded, respect evident in his expression at her determination despite her vulnerable condition. "Grace will need assistance preparing supplies," he said. "Healing herbs, bandages, whatever might be needed if conflict does become unavoidable. That work would help our preparations significantly if you feel strong enough to contribute." "I feel strong enough," Elena confirmed, grateful for a way to channel her fear and guilt into productive action, rather than simply waiting anxiously for whatever might come next. As the afternoon wore on, the previously peaceful camp transformed steadily into something more purposeful and urgent, fighters strengthening defensive positions along the territory borders, supplies being carefully cataloged and prepared for potential conflict, tension building beneath the surface of daily activities that had felt so calm and settled only hours before. Elena worked alongside Grace, preparing medical supplies late into the evening, grateful for the physical activity that helped distract from the growing anxiety about what Kane's approaching forces might mean for the fragile happiness she had found in this unexpected home. As she finally settled into bed that night, exhausted from the day's preparations, she found herself praying to whatever forces governed the spirit world, that this territory, and the people who had shown her such unexpected kindness, would survive whatever conflict now loomed on their horizon. The days that followed passed in a blur of constant preparation, the entire territory transforming into something resembling an armed camp, as Draven's fighters worked tirelessly to strengthen every possible defense against Kane's approaching forces. Elena found herself drawn more deeply into the daily rhythms of these preparations, her initial fear gradually settling into a determined focus that helped her feel less helpless against the looming threat. Grace had taught her which herbs held the strongest healing properties, which combinations could reduce fever or slow bleeding, knowledge that felt increasingly essential as the reality of potential conflict grew closer with each passing day. Elena spent hours in the healer's quarters, grinding herbs and preparing bandages, grateful for productive work that kept her hands and mind occupied against the constant undercurrent of anxiety. Draven visited each evening despite his obvious exhaustion from overseeing the territory's defensive preparations, always finding time to check on Elena's well-being before retreating to whatever strategic planning consumed his remaining hours. Their conversations during these brief visits had grown quieter, weighted with the awareness of what loomed ahead, though the warmth between them remained steady despite the tension. "The scouts report Kane's forces have crossed into the neutral lands south of our border," Draven told her one evening, exhaustion evident in the lines around his eyes as he settled into the chair across from where she rested near the fire. "They are moving faster than we initially anticipated." "How much time?" Elena asked, setting aside the bandages she had been folding to give him her full attention. "Perhaps 4 days," Draven said grimly, "possibly less, if they maintain their current pace." Elena felt her stomach tighten with fear, though she forced herself to remain composed, drawing on the strength she had discovered within herself since fleeing Kane's cruelty weeks earlier. "Are your fighters ready?" she asked, needing reassurance, even as she recognized the difficulty of the question she was asking. "As ready as they can be, given the timeline we have been working with," Draven said honestly, never one to offer false comfort, even when Elena might have appreciated the temporary relief it could provide. "We have strengthened our border defenses significantly, and every fighter in this territory understands what is at stake if Kane's forces succeed in breaching our lands." "And if they do succeed?" Elena asked quietly, forcing herself to voice the fear she had been carrying since first learning of Kane's approaching forces. Draven reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his with gentle but firm reassurance. "They will not succeed," he said, conviction filling his voice, despite the uncertainty that surely weighed on him as heavily as it did on her. "I will not allow Kane to take you or your child, Elena. Whatever it requires, this territory will hold against his forces." Elena wanted desperately to believe him, drawing what comfort she could from his confidence, even as worry continued to churn beneath the surface of her composure. She thought of the child growing inside her, so close now to being born, and felt a fierce protectiveness that helped steady her against the fear threatening to overwhelm her. "I have been thinking," she said carefully, needing to voice a concern that had been building since learning of Kane's approaching forces. "About the ancient pack law you mentioned before, about how this child's birth might affect the political situation. Is there a way to use that law to our advantage, rather than simply waiting for Kane to attack?" Draven's expression sharpened with interest at her question, clearly considering the strategic implications she had raised. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, giving her the space to fully explain her thinking. "If the child is born here, under your protection, before Kane's forces arrive," Elena said, working through the logic as she spoke, "does that not strengthen the legal claim to protection, under whatever ancient laws govern these situations? Rather than Kane approaching a pregnant woman he might claim as still technically belonging to his territory, he would be approaching a mother and child, already recognized under the protection of your bloodline." Draven's eyes widened slightly with understanding, clearly impressed by the strategic thinking behind her suggestion. "That could significantly complicate his legal justification for the attack," he said thoughtfully. "The Pack Council he answers to would need to consider the implications of attacking a recognized bloodline protection, not simply reclaiming an abandoned wife and unborn child." "Is there anything that can be done to formalize that protection quickly?" Elena asked, hope building despite the uncertainty of the situation they still faced. "There are ceremonies," Draven said slowly, considering the possibilities. "Traditional rites that could establish formal protection status for both you and the child under this territory's laws, though such ceremonies typically require preparation and witnesses to be considered legitimate by outside pack councils. But it is possible," Elena pressed, needing to understand whether this strategy might actually help their situation. "It is possible," Draven confirmed, "though it would require moving quickly, and it would represent a significant commitment from both of us, formally binding your protection and the child's future to this territory, in ways that extend beyond simple hospitality." Elena considered his words carefully, understanding the weight of what he was describing. This would not be a simple political maneuver, but something that would fundamentally alter her relationship with this territory, with Draven himself, in ways that carried lasting implications beyond the immediate crisis they faced. "I trust you," she finally said, meeting his eyes with quiet determination. "And I trust this territory, more than I ever trusted the place I once called home. If this ceremony can help protect my child from Kane's cruel calculations, then I want to move forward with it." Draven studied her for a long moment, something profound passing across his features as he processed her words. "This is not a decision to make lightly, Elena," he said carefully. "The ceremony would bind you and the child to this territory permanently, regardless of how the conflict with Kane resolves. Are you certain this is what you want?" Elena thought of everything she had experienced since that terrible night in the storm, of Kane's cold rejection and calculated cruelty, of the unexpected kindness and growing warmth she had found instead in Draven's territory. She thought of the fighters who had welcomed her without judgment, of Grace's patient teaching, of the children who ran laughing through the camp despite the looming threat of conflict. "I am certain," she said firmly. "This territory has become more of a home to me in these past weeks than Ashford lands ever truly felt, even during the years I spent there as Kane's wife. I want my child to grow up knowing the kindness and protection I have found here, not the cold ambition that defined their father's choices." Draven's expression softened with something that looked remarkably like relief, though tempered still by the serious weight of the decision they were discussing. "Then I will speak with the territory elders tomorrow about arranging the ceremony," he said. "We will need to move quickly, given the timeline of Kane's approaching forces, but I believe it can be prepared before his arrival." As their conversation shifted toward the practical details of preparing for both the ceremony and the coming conflict, Elena felt a strange calm settling over her, despite the danger still looming on their horizon. Whatever happened when Kane's forces finally arrived at the territory borders, she would face it, not as an abandoned wife fleeing helplessly through a storm, but as someone who had found genuine belonging and protection in a place that had never asked her to prove her worth before offering kindness. The fire crackled steadily beside them as the evening deepened into night, and Elena found herself grateful, despite the fear and uncertainty ahead, for the unexpected path that had led her to this territory. To this man who had shown her what genuine care and partnership could look like. So different from the cold calculation she had endured during her years with Cain. Whatever challenges awaited them in the coming days, she felt increasingly confident that she would not face them alone. The ceremony took place 2 days later, under a sky finally clear of the storms that had marked Elena's arrival in the territory weeks earlier. The territory elders had gathered quickly once Draven explained the urgency of the situation, and preparations moved forward with remarkable efficiency, despite the short timeline they were working within. Elena stood at the center of the clearing, where fighters usually trained each morning, now transformed with careful decoration for the ceremony ahead. Grace had helped her dress in garments traditional to such occasions, simple but elegant fabric in deep colors that reflected the territory's connection to the old bloodline magic that had brought Ashen to her rescue that first stormy night. Draven stood across from her, dressed similarly in ceremonial garments that Elena had never seen him wear before, his expression solemn but warm as their eyes met across the clearing. The entire territory had gathered to witness the proceedings, fighters and families alike standing in respectful silence as the eldest of the territory elders stepped forward to begin the ceremony. "We gather today to formalize protection under the old laws," the elder announced, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd despite her advanced age. "For Elena, who arrived among us seeking shelter, and for the child she carries, who will be born under this territory's protection, regardless of what challenges may come." Elena felt her heart racing as the ceremony continued, the elder speaking words in an older dialect Elena did not fully understand, though she caught enough fragments to recognize the solemnity of what was being invoked. Ashen appeared partway through the ceremony, emerging from the tree line to take a position beside Draven, the massive wolf's presence lending additional weight to the proceedings. "The bond between bloodline and protected must be witnessed and acknowledged," the elder continued, gesturing for Elena and Draven to step closer together at the center of the clearing. "Draven Voss, do you accept the formal protection of Elena and her unborn child under the laws of this territory, binding your bloodline's resources and your fighters' strength to their safety?" "I do," Draven said, his voice steady and clear, despite the significance of the commitment he was making before the entire assembled territory. "Elena," the elder turned toward her, "do you accept this protection, understanding the binding nature of what is being offered, and the responsibilities that come with accepting shelter under this bloodline's care?" Elena looked at Draven, at the warmth and sincerity in his expression, at the fighters and families who had shown her nothing but kindness during her time in this territory, and felt no hesitation in her answer. "I do," she said firmly, her voice carrying clearly across the silent clearing. Ashen stepped forward at this moment, moving to stand directly between Elena and Draven, and the massive wolf lowered its head in what looked remarkably like a formal bow before both of them. The elder's eyes widened slightly at this unexpected gesture, and murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd at the significance of what they were witnessing. "The bloodline itself acknowledges this bond," the elder said, her voice carrying newfound reverence. "It has been many years since Ashen offered such recognition to anyone beyond direct bloodline members. This protection is not merely political, but spiritual, blessed by the ancient bond this territory carries with the spirit world." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes at the unexpected depth of what was happening, overwhelmed by the genuine welcome she was receiving from this territory and its remarkable protective spirit. She reached down instinctively, resting her hand against Ashen's massive head as the wolf remained bowed before her, grateful beyond words for the creature that had led her to safety that terrible stormy night. "Thank you," she whispered, though she was uncertain whether her words were meant for Ashen, for Draven, or for the entire territory that had shown her such unexpected kindness during the most difficult period of her life. The ceremony concluded with a shared meal, the entire territory celebrating together despite the looming threat of Cain's approaching forces, a determined show of unity and strength that Elena found deeply moving. Fighters who had seemed intimidating during her first days in the territory now approached her with genuine warmth, congratulating her on the formal protection, while offering their own commitment to defending both her and the child she carried. As evening settled over the celebration, Draven found her seated near the edge of the gathering, watching the fires and the community, that had so unexpectedly become her own. He settled beside her, exhaustion from the day's events evident in his posture, though satisfaction and warmth colored his expression as he looked at her. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly, giving her space to process the significance of what had just occurred. "Protected," Elena said honestly, surprised by how true the word felt after everything she had endured since that stormy night weeks earlier. "More protected than I have felt in years, honestly, even during the time I believed my marriage to Cain offered me security and belonging." Draven's expression softened at her words, though something more complicated flickered behind his eyes. "I meant what I said during the ceremony," he told her. "This bond is not simply political convenience, Elena. I care for you deeply, and for the child you carry, as though they were already my own. Whatever comes when Cain's forces arrive, I will do everything in my power to protect what we have built here." Elena felt her heart swell at his words, gratitude and growing affection mixing together, as she considered how far their relationship had progressed since that first frightened night when Ashen led her into his territory. "I care for you as well," she said softly, the admission feeling both natural and significant, given everything the ceremony had formalized between them. "More than I expected to feel again after everything Cain's betrayal cost me." They sat together as the celebration continued around them, comfortable in the quiet understanding that had grown between them, though the awareness of Cain's approaching forces remained ever present beneath the surface of their contentment. Elena knew the coming days would test everything the ceremony had just formalized, that Draven's protection would soon face its most significant challenge since her arrival in his territory. But as she looked around at the fighters and families who had welcomed her so completely, at the bond Ashen had recognized between herself and Draven, at the genuine warmth and care she had found in this unexpected home, Elena felt increasingly confident that whatever Cain brought against these borders, this territory and its remarkable leader would find a way to protect what they had built together. Later that night, as the celebration finally quieted and most of the territory retired to prepare for whatever challenges the coming days would bring, Elena felt the first sharp pull of what she recognized, with sudden clarity, as early labor beginning. She pressed a hand against her belly, breathing through the unexpected sensation, uncertain whether to feel joy at her child's impending arrival, or fear at the timing, so close now to Cain's approaching forces that the coincidence felt almost cruel. She made her way carefully toward Grace's quarters, determined to confirm what her body seemed to be telling her, hopeful that perhaps this simply represented false signs, rather than the true beginning of her child's journey into a world still uncertain and dangerous. Whatever came next, she knew she would need every ounce of strength she had discovered within herself, since fleeing that terrible storm weeks earlier. Grace confirmed within minutes of examining her that Elena had indeed entered the early stages of labor, her expression calm, but focused, as she began preparing the room for what would follow in the coming hours. "The baby seems eager to arrive despite the timing," Grace said, offering Elena a reassuring smile despite the complicated circumstances surrounding this moment. "Try to remain calm. Your body knows what to do, even if the timing feels less than ideal." Word spread quickly through the territory, and Draven arrived at the healer's quarters within minutes of receiving news that Elena's labor had begun, his expression a complicated mixture of joy and worry as he took in the scene before him. "Is she all right?" he asked Grace immediately, his eyes never leaving Elena where she sat, breathing carefully through the early contractions building steadily through her body. "She is progressing normally," Grace assured him, though her tone carried an undercurrent of urgency that Elena did not miss. "Though we should prepare for the possibility that this labor may take considerable time, and we need to consider carefully how this affects our defensive preparations given Cain's approaching forces." Draven's jaw tightened at this reminder of the looming threat, and Elena watched him process the difficult reality they now faced, needing to balance her well-being during labor against the ongoing preparations necessary to defend the territory against Cain's arrival. "How much time do the scouts estimate before Cain's forces reach our borders?" he asked, though Elena suspected he already knew the answer would not offer much comfort. "Perhaps 2 days, based on the most recent reports," the scout who had followed him into the room confirmed grimly. "Possibly less." Elena felt fear coil through her chest at this news, worried about facing both the exhausting process of labor and the imminent threat of Cain's arrival within such a compressed time frame. But she forced herself to focus on the immediate reality of her body's demands, trusting Grace's steady guidance through the building intensity of her contractions. Hours passed slowly, Elena's labor progressing with the natural rhythm that Grace had promised, though the pain grew steadily more intense as the night wore on. Draven remained close throughout, though he divided his attention between supporting Elena and receiving updates from his scouts about Kane's continued approach toward their borders. "You are doing wonderfully," Draven told her during a brief lull between contractions, wiping perspiration from her forehead with a cool cloth Grace had provided. "The baby will be here soon, and then we will face whatever comes, with the strength of this entire territory behind us." Elena managed a weak smile despite her exhaustion, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her through the exhausting process. "I am frightened," she admitted quietly, honesty feeling important, given the significance of everything happening simultaneously in her life. Not just about the labor, but about what happens when Kane arrives and finds his child already born under your protection. "He will find nothing but strength and unity," Draven said firmly, conviction filling his voice, despite the exhaustion evident in his own expression, from the sleepless hours of preparation and vigil beside her. "This territory stands united behind you, and this child, Elena. Kane's ambitions will find no easy victory here, regardless of what forces he brings against our borders." As dawn broke over the territory, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Elena's labor finally reached its most intense phase, Grace's calm guidance helping her through the final difficult stretch of bringing her child into the world. Draven remained beside her throughout, offering steady support despite his own visible exhaustion, refusing to leave her side even as scouts continued arriving with updates about Kane's steadily approaching forces. Finally, with the morning sun fully risen and casting warm light through the windows of the healer's quarters, Elena's child entered the world, with a strong, healthy cry that filled the room with an overwhelming sense of relief and joy, despite the circumstances surrounding the birth. Grace worked quickly and efficiently, and within moments, placed a small, healthy daughter into Elena's exhausted but joyful arms. "She is beautiful," Draven said, his voice thick with emotion, as he looked at the newborn child. Tears, he did not bother hiding, gathering in his eyes, as he watched Elena hold her daughter for the first time. "Absolutely beautiful, Elena." Elena looked down at her daughter's small face, overwhelmed by love and protectiveness, so intense it nearly took her breath away, forgetting momentarily the looming threat that awaited them beyond the walls of this room. "She has your eyes," Elena said softly, looking up at Draven with wonder in her expression, as she noticed the striking similarity between her daughter's dark eyes and Draven's own, despite the child not being biologically his. Draven's expression grew even more emotional at her observation, though he did not correct the implication behind her words. Instead, he reached out carefully, and Elena allowed him to gently touch their newborn daughter's tiny hand, watching with quiet awe as the infant's fingers curled instinctively around his own. "She is safe now," Draven said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of the formal ceremony they had completed just days before. "Protected under this territory's bloodline, regardless of what Kane believes he has any right to claim." Their private moment was interrupted by the sound of urgent footsteps outside the room, and moments later, one of Draven's senior fighters appeared at the door, his expression grave despite clearly trying to soften the news he carried for the sake of the joyful occasion he was interrupting. "Kane's forces have been spotted at the southern border," the fighter reported, his voice low but urgent. "They will reach our defensive lines within hours, not the days we originally estimated." The joy of the previous moments shifted immediately into tense urgency, Draven's expression hardening into the focused determination Elena had witnessed during their earlier strategic discussions. He looked between Elena, still holding their newborn daughter, and the fighter waiting for instructions, torn between his role as protector of this precious new family and his responsibility to lead the territory's defense. "Stay with Elena and the child," Draven instructed the fighter, before turning back toward Elena with fierce determination in his expression. "I need to organize our defenses immediately. Grace will ensure you and the baby remain safe here, but I promise you, Elena, Kane will not reach this room. This territory will hold, and your daughter will grow up safe, exactly as we promised during that ceremony." Elena nodded, fear for her daughter's safety, mixing with faith in Draven's determination and the territory's collective strength. "Be careful," she said softly, watching him prepare to leave, despite the exhaustion evident in his posture after the long night supporting her through labor. Draven leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss against Elena's forehead, then another against their newborn daughter's tiny head, before straightening with renewed purpose in his expression. "I will return to you both," he promised, "whatever it takes to ensure Kane's forces do not breach these walls." He departed quickly, and Elena listened to the sounds of the territory mobilizing outside her window, fighters calling instructions to each other, the distant sound of horns signaling the approaching threat that would test everything this territory had built during the peaceful weeks since her arrival. She held her daughter close, praying to whatever forces had guided Ashen to find her that stormy night, hoping desperately that those same forces would protect this territory, and everyone within it, through the conflict now bearing down upon their borders. The sounds of approaching conflict grew steadily louder throughout the morning, and Elena remained in the healer's quarters with Grace and the assigned fighter, holding her newborn daughter close, while listening anxiously to the distant commotion beyond the walls. Grace worked calmly around her, preparing additional medical supplies in case the fighters returned wounded from whatever confrontation now unfolded at the territory's borders. "Kane has reached the northern gate," the fighter reported after receiving updates from a runner who had been sent to relay information from the front lines. "Draven has assembled the fighters to meet him there, along with the territory elders who intend to formally present the ceremony documentation, establishing your protection under the old laws." Elena's heart raced at this news, understanding immediately that Draven intended to resolve this conflict through legal and political means before resorting to actual violence between the two forces now facing each other at the territory's boundary. She desperately wished she could witness the confrontation herself, though she recognized the wisdom in remaining safely away from the tension unfolding at the gate, especially with her daughter so newly born and vulnerable. Hours passed in agonizing uncertainty, Elena finding it difficult to focus on anything beyond worry, for Draven's safety and the fate of the territory that had become her true home. She fed and comforted her daughter as best she could manage despite her anxiety, grateful for Grace's steady presence helping guide her through the unfamiliar demands of caring for a newborn while conflict loomed just beyond the walls. Finally, as afternoon light began slanting through the windows, the fighter stationed with Elena received word through another runner, his expression shifting from tense alertness to cautious relief as he processed the message. "The confrontation appears to be resolving without violence," he reported to Elena. "The elders have presented the formal ceremony documentation to Kane's forces, and there are reports of significant tension among his allied fighters upon learning the full circumstances of your situation." Elena felt hope building cautiously in her chest at this news, though she remained anxious until she could see Draven himself and confirm his safety. "What circumstances?" she asked, curious what specific information might have shifted the confrontation away from violence. "Word has spread among Kane's allied forces about his treatment of you," the fighter explained. "About abandoning his pregnant wife in a storm, about his affair with your sister, about his political calculations regarding reclaiming you, only after learning of the ancient law protections established here. Several of his allied pacts are reportedly refusing to continue supporting his aggressive stance once they understood the full truth of his actions." Relief flooded through Elena at this news, understanding that Draven's honesty and the territory's transparent presentation of the truth had succeeded in undermining Kane's justification for the attack far more effectively than any battle could have accomplished. She held her daughter closer, overwhelming gratitude filling her chest at the possibility that this conflict might resolve without the violence she had feared throughout the tense morning hours. It was another hour before Draven finally returned to the healer's quarters, his expression exhausted, but carrying an unmistakable note of triumph as he entered the room, and immediately sought out Elena and their daughter. Elena's breath caught at the sight of him, relief overwhelming her, as she confirmed he had returned safely from the confrontation. "It is over," Draven said, moving quickly to her side, and settling carefully onto the edge of her bed, his eyes never leaving her face, as he processed the reality of the successful resolution. Kane's own allies turned against him once the full truth of his actions became known. The Pack Council he answers to has stripped him of his authority, recognizing that a leader who would abandon his pregnant wife and then attempt to reclaim her purely for political advantage cannot be trusted to lead honorably. Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes at this news, overwhelming relief mixing with a complicated sense of vindication, after everything Kane's cruelty had cost her. "And Mira?" she asked quietly, curious about her sister's fate, given the role she had played in the events leading to Elena's exile from Ashford territory. "She has been removed from any position of influence within the pack," Draven said carefully. The council did not look favorably on her involvement in Kane's betrayal, regardless of whatever complicated circumstances led to her choices. Elena absorbed this information quietly, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and acceptance about her sister's fate, understanding that Mira would need to find her own path toward whatever redemption or consequences awaited her, separate from Elena's own journey toward healing and new beginnings in this territory. "What happens now?" Elena asked, looking up at Draven with a mixture of exhaustion and hope after the intense events of the past day. Draven's expression softened with warmth as he looked between Elena and their sleeping daughter, still held carefully in her arms. "Now," he said, "we build the life we began establishing during that ceremony 2 nights ago. Your daughter grows up safe and protected in this territory, surrounded by people who genuinely care for her well-being, rather than viewing her as political inconvenience or calculated advantage." "Our daughter," Elena corrected gently, watching Draven's expression shift with surprised emotion at her deliberate choice of words, acknowledging the role he had already claimed in their newborn's life, despite the absence of any biological connection between them. "Our daughter," Draven repeated softly, reaching out to gently touch the infant's small hand once more, wonder and love evident in his expression, as their daughter's fingers curled instinctively around his own. "I would be honored to raise her as my own, Elena, if that is truly what you want." "It is exactly what I want," Elena said firmly, meeting his eyes with complete certainty, despite the exhaustion of the past intense day. "You have shown me and this child more genuine care in these past weeks than Kane ever offered during our entire marriage. I want our daughter to grow up knowing that kind of love, not the cold calculation I endured for years before Ashen led me to your territory." Draven leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss against Elena's lips, tender and full of promise for the future they were choosing to build together, despite the unconventional circumstances that had brought them to this moment. "Then let us build that future together," he said softly. "You, our daughter, and this territory that has already welcomed you both so completely." Outside the window, the sounds of celebration began rising from the territory as word spread of the successful resolution to the day's tense confrontation, fighters and families alike gathering to celebrate not only the avoided conflict, but the safe arrival of the newest member of their community. Elena listened to the joyful sounds, feeling profound gratitude for the unexpected path that had led her from that terrible storm weeks earlier to this moment of genuine belonging and love. She thought of Ashen, the spirit wolf who had found her collapsed and abandoned in the rain, who had led her across that boundary into a territory everyone claimed to fear, into the protection of a man whose kindness had proven far greater than his reputation suggested. Whatever ancient wisdom had guided that wolf's actions that stormy night, Elena felt profound gratitude for the family and home she had found as a result. As evening settled over the territory, Draven remained beside her, their daughter resting peacefully between them, while outside their window, the sounds of celebration continued late into the night, marking not just the resolution of conflict, but the beginning of a new chapter for Elena and the family she had never expected to find in the exiled territory of a man the world had wrongly called a monster. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, Elena faced them now not alone and abandoned, but surrounded by genuine love and unwavering protection, exactly as she and her daughter deserved.